So a friend of mine sent me this video by Jordan Peterson, who throughout this video we will only refer to as Daddy, talking about philosopher Michel Foucault. And after watching it,
I've read a fair bit of Foucault.
I knew I had to make a reaction video. I watched this video and just started raging, going through the books I have and notes I've taken. My friend was partially inspired by Daddy to get involved in philosophy, and he knows that I'm kind of a Foucault stan, so he wanted to get my opinion. Alright, I got Lord Ganesha to help us out. We got our hammer. Let's do this. The video my friend sent me is called Daddy, Mental Illness, a Social Construct? Foucault? By the YouTube page Bite Size Philosophy, and the description says, psychology professor Dr. Daddy comments on Foucault's critique of mental health institutions. But this video is actually a snippet of a lecture that Daddy gave in 2016. It's up on Daddy's page, and this video is called Maps of Meanings Part 1, Osirus, Set, Isis, and Horus. Maps of Meaning is Daddy's main work, perhaps his magnum opus. So, Daddy only talks about Foucault at the beginning of this video, so we're just gonna focus on that. Here we go!
I've been reading this book recently, which the title of I can't remember, unfortunately, but I'll tell it to you after class. It's a critique of certain lines of left-wing ideological thinking, including the existential thought of people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Foucault. And
did he just say Foucault was a existentialist? Oh, this is not looking good. I got a bad feeling about this. First off, Foucault was not an existentialist. Sartre and Foucault were philosophically opposed to each other's thought. Both Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir criticized Foucault's thought as bourgeois, with Sartre writing in a review about Foucault's book The Order of Things that Foucault was, quote, the last barricade of the bourgeoisie, to which Foucault replied by saying, poor bourgeoisie! If they needed me as a barricade, then they've already lost power.
One of the most trenchant critiques of Sartre, because he well, then there's Foucault. Foucault, who I have no respect for, by the way. I think I've read a fair bit of Foucault, and I think everything he says is obvious. So, for example, he criticizes the idea of mental illness as a social construct. It's well, yeah. Obviously, I mean, it's not like psychiatrists and psychologists and mental health professionals who are relatively well informed haven't known about that for the last 60 years. I mean, it might be a revelation to people who don't notice that psychiatry, for example, is something like a compromise between the patient, biology, and the social world.
If we look at the history of psychology, psychology was originally a metaphysical term, specifically referring to the metaphysics of the human. It was Christianity, which Daddy is very enamored with Judeo-Christian values, that posited that all humans have a soul which exists independently of all social influences. This continued with Descartes all the way to Kant, and then Hegel, and even phenomenology, which was still very influential when Foucault was a lad and coming of age. So the idea that it was obvious that mental illness and the field of psychology were not social constructions, or were not influenced by social constructions, is simply not the case. Even today, we still have Christian psychologists that still rely on the Christian concept of an ahistorical, asocial soul to explain mental illness. Foucault says in an interview entitled Truth and Power, which I'll link in the description so that you can go look with your eyeballs. Foucault says when he was studying in the 1950s, and he started pointing out how sciences like psychology and medicine were profoundly enmeshed in social structures, quote, what rather threw me at the time was the fact that the question I was posing totally failed to interest those to whom I addressed it. They regarded it as a problem which was politically unimportant and epistemologically vulgar.
Psychiatric ailments often have a biological tilt, but the way they manifest themselves in society is clearly conditioned in very intense ways by the particular conditions obtaining at the point that the person who has that biological predisposition exists. Even whether or not that's pathological can be tilted one way or another by cultural norms.
And then, of course, when you're dealing with issues like insurance payment and treatment and hospitalization, obviously you're pulling in all sorts of systems that are by no means purely scientific. But I don't find it a particularly useful critique. It's obvious as far as I'm concerned. And the other thing that Foucault did, I mean, I think this is the typical, especially the French intellectuals' typical sleight of hand once Marxism became, once you were no longer able to call yourself a committed Marxist. Because a committed Marxism had led to unbelievable brutality, on a scale that had never probably,
I think, had never been experienced in the entire history of the planet, at least in terms of its reach and duration. You didn't get to call yourself a Marxist anymore, although there were still people, and you still see them saying, well, that wasn't real Marxism, which I think is a cop-out of staggering proportions. It usually means, well, if I was the person running the country, that wouldn't have happened. That's the logic behind it. They didn't put the principles into practice properly. It's like, yeah, well, lots of people put the damn principles into practice, and the same thing happened everywhere. So at some point,
you have to kind of wonder if there's something wrong with the principles. Anyways, what Foucault did was take the Marxist presupposition that everything could be boiled down to economics and economic power, and translated it into the idea that everything just boiled down to power. And that the reason that we have institutions is to include and to exclude, and that the institutions always run for the benefit of those at the top. It's like, well, yeah, that's a little bit true, but it's a scientist would look at that and say, yeah, well, probably, power dynamics in a functioning economic and political system maybe account for 10% of the variance. So, for example, if you have say you want to go to school.
I've read a fair bit of Foucault.
Well, if your parents went to the school, you're more likely to get in, but you're not that much more likely to get in, and you still have to be, roughly speaking, what happens is that if you have a pretty decent, high school GPA, and you do very well on the SATs, and you have some other talents of some sort, because that's also necessary, then they might pick you over someone else who's roughly equally qualified if you have a familial history of attendance at the school. So obviously you get an advantage, but it's not the kind of advantage
that accounts for the entirety of how the system is structured. It's an advantage. Well, you can say, well, that's not fair. It's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. Most systems are certainly not 100% either fair or just. Definitely not. But, instead of comparing them to utopia, you might compare them to another system, which is the only reasonable way to do it. It's like everything looks terrible when you compare it to the best thing you can possibly imagine. But the best thing you can possibly imagine is it's an empty fiction, because it's so devoid of detailed content that you can't use it as a guide to reality. Now, I mean, the idea that things could be better has its roots in some sense in a broad-scale utopian project, and I believe that things could be better, but that doesn't mean that when you're doing an analysis of a complex system, you get to compare it to an ideological utopia and then describe all the reasons that it's bad. It's not appropriate to do that. It's too simplistic. You're not going to do anything to actually address the problems that the system has if you take that approach.
And then, of course, pure utopian thinking is extraordinarily dangerous, because if you think that your way of molding society into some ultimate state of perfection is headed towards some ultimate state of perfection, then you can justify absolutely anything you do right now on the basis of the fact that things are going to improve so radically in the future. And that means any of your behaviors are excused. The end is worth it. Well,
if someone says that, you have to kind of wonder what they're actually planning. Excuse me. What they're actually planning to do. So, well, what's the issue? Well, the issue is that the same critic with regards to Foucault, he said, it's basically the same thing, that Foucault criticized a variety of profound institutions, sexual institutions, say, like marriage, and then institutions of power like prisons, and institutions of mental health, the whole institutional framework. He criticized them on the basis of power and exclusion. And
so Daddy says that Foucault critiques these profound institutions. But Daddy never says what critique means for Foucault. But he seems to imply that critique means negation. According to Daddy, Foucault critiques psychiatry as socially constructed, and therefore mental illness isn't real. Again, Foucault never says this anywhere.
But, Foucault also made the presupposition. The problem with that presupposition is that everything is about something else, is that it's almost impossible to see how it can't be applied to Foucault himself. So you'd have to ask, if you were a student of Foucault, what power aims
Discipline me, Dad.
analyze everything in terms of power. And I actually think with Foucault it's pretty obvious. So, but it's a game that never goes anywhere. Okay, so I thought about that a lot. It's like, is there any system that you can develop? And this is partly why I'm talking to you about this.
Wow, that's a lot. Lot to deconstruct there. Yikes.